This when you do leave, you might as well close the door so that children don't come running in or whatever, like in that famous video.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to phyloseminar.org. Today we have a special talk that's a little atypical. We're going to take a break from our usual diet of methods and results from sequence analysis and hear from Ford Doolittle about philosophy. Before I introduce Ford, I want to remind people that the Q&A app is gone now, so you can ask questions through Twitter or IRC, as described in the attending section of the Phyloseminar website. Dr. Doolittle is well known for his foundational work on the genetics of microorganisms. This includes making significant contributions to the study of cyanobacteria, including evidence for the endosymbiont origins of chloroplasts, and showing the importance of horizontal gene transfer in prokaryotic evolution. He led the research community in moving away from a single tree representation of organismal evolution. Dr. Doolittle received his PhD from Stanford University in 1967 under Charles Janofsky and did postdocs with Sol Spiegelman and Norman Pace. He has been Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie since 2007. He has many awards and titles, including being a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, and is the winner of the 2014 Herzberg Medal of Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Welcome, Dr. Doolittle, and thanks for participating.
Thank you. So I guess I will just start. The slides are all visible there, I presume.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, this will be a very atypical talk from the others that I've looked at on Phyloseminar. This is going to be quite different. I hope it will be interesting to you. The first slide shows me in my study, as it were, and explains what it is I've been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 years, I guess, which is to think about biology and molecular evolution and some of the larger questions that have always interested me, but now I'm sort of free to pursue them for their own sake. So I've been interested in questions about the meaning of the word function, which is certainly one of the more contested words in molecular evolution, about the meanings of homology, the meaning of the word life itself, not life as a thing, but the meaning of the word life, and in particular about natural selection, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm trying to avoid drifting into what Nathalie Angier called philosophose. So I'm trying not just to be an elderly scientist who's thinking about the meanings of things. I'm trying to do so in a semi-professional way, which means that I am trying to integrate myself as much as possible within the community of philosophy biology. I do strongly feel that biology and philosophy have very strong interconnections. There is a discipline called philosophy of biology which intersects those disciplines, and which I think has particularly important ways that it can make interventions in biology, because I think most of us biologists actually do have a philosophy. In fact, one of the statements that I really like that I recently read by a philosopher, John Dupre, is something like, metaphysics can be ignored, but it can't be escaped. I think that's true. We all have particular metaphysical commitments. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, though. I'm going to talk about a particular paper that I have just published. It's in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. It should be online, if not today, tomorrow. It was online in a kind of a garbled fashion, but now I hope it's online properly. And this paper actually harkens back to a paper I wrote 36 years ago about the Gaia hypothesis, a very critical paper, the Gaia hypothesis. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been sort of working my way back to thinking about it, publishing mostly in journals where philosophy is part of the title, and working my way back into trying to think about how it is possible to think about natural selection in a more global context than we normally do. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and that's why it seems to me to be quite untypical of what Philoseminars are normally about, but I hope it will be interesting to you. So here's my outline. I'm going to remind you, well, probably some of you never even heard of the Gaia hypothesis, what the Gaia hypothesis is. I'm going to describe it as basically as a kind of a major transition in evolution. Major transitions in evolution is another philosophical buzzword referring to a book that John Maynard Smith published in 1995. I'm going to talk about why the Gaia hypothesis, which first appeared 20 years before, in the early 70s, why Darwinists, including me, basically hated the Gaia hypothesis, thought that it was basic academic nonsense. The nature of those objections that we had. I'm going to talk about what's called the Daisy World model, which is an effort on the part of Gaia supporters to bolster the Gaia hypothesis with some model systems, which I personally don't think did that for them. I'm going to nevertheless say that maybe there is some way that we can understand Gaia in the way that its originators originally intended by reformulating the hypothesis. And in order to do that, we also have to reformulate what we think evolution by natural selection is all about in a way which I think is radical, but probably I'd like to think that Charles Darwin, were he alive today, would accept it. That reformulation doesn't actually get me all the way to Gaia, but it gets me close, and I'll talk then about the final steps that I think are necessary to come up with a coherent formulation of the Gaia hypothesis. I'm not actually arguing this is true. I'm taking, I guess, what might be a sort of a philosophical position here. I'm saying that if you want to believe that the Gaia hypothesis is true, that thinking along the lines that I propose is what you have to do. So the Gaia hypothesis was first formulated and promulgated by James Lovelock, who was an independent inventor, a very bright man, and a very wealthy man because of his inventions in the UK. And he was soon joined by Lynn Margulis, who was, as most of you will probably know, the originator, well, not the originator, the re-inventor of the endosymbiont hypothesis for the origin of chloroplasts and mitochondria, and probably one of the leading biological theorists in the 70s or so. Towards the end of her life, Lynn drifted off into spaces where many of us would not go, like HIV denial and 9/11 denial. But she was always a very inventive and imaginative thinker, and her reformulation and promulgation of the endosymbiont hypothesis turned out to be very prescient and got many of us started in looking at evolutionary biology as molecular biologists. So the Gaia hypothesis, as formulated by Lynn and Lovelock in 1974, argues that, and I'm just going to read my quotes on the screen because I have no way of knowing how many of you are out there and how fast you can read, so I will just read. The total ensemble of living organisms which constitutes a biosphere can act as a single entity to regulate chemical composition, surface pH, and possibly also climate. The notion of the biosphere is an active adaptive control system able to maintain the Earth in homeostasis we are calling the Gaia hypothesis. And a book, the first book that Lovelock wrote on the Gaia hypothesis, appeared in 1979, and in that book he referred to Gaia as the largest living creature on Earth. I read that book, and I was also sensitized to the Gaia hypothesis by Lynn Margulis herself because we were fairly close friends in the 70s. Both Lovelock and Lynn, who died a few years back, have wrote many books on the Gaia hypothesis. Most of Lovelock's books return the word Gaia. For Lynn, the Gaia hypothesis was just the largest version of her general understanding of evolution as a cooperative and symbiotic process. She emphasized symbiosis as a driving force in evolutionary biology. Partly that's why she emphasized the endosymbiont hypothesis, but the Gaia hypothesis was the same kind of thinking writ very large. Neither Lynn nor Lovelock would have acknowledged that relationship, I think, to the much more standard orthodox thinking of John Maynard Smith and Jorth Southmurray, and this book, which the cover of which I'm representing here, didn't appear for another 20 years, but I still think that that's one of the best ways to understand the Gaia hypothesis. So I'm going to say a few words about that. That book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, proposed that one way to look at the evolutionary process, and one way, in fact, to think about progress, or at least the movement towards greater complexity, was to realize that often what we understood to be the history of evolution involved the incorporation of smaller units, smaller evolutionary units, smaller units of selection into larger units of selection, in the sense, for instance, that single-celled organisms became multicellular organisms with their evolutionary interests subsumed by that of the multicellular entity. One could argue that animal societies are higher levels of organization that consume or subsume the interests of many multicellular organisms, stuff like that. The levels of transition of control don't map perfectly to what they thought were major transitions, but many of them do. And for many of them, they thought that what was exhibited was what's shown below the book cover. Entities capable of independent replication before the transition can replicate only as part of a larger whole afterwards. So in that context, which is still a very powerful way of formulating our understanding of evolution writ large, the Gaia hypothesis, I think, comes out as the mother of all major transitions in evolution. It's the highest level of selection under which the interests of the participating taxa are subsumed. That's what Lovelock meant by saying that Gaia was an organism, and what Lovelock and Margulis meant by saying that it was a global regulatory system. Furthermore, I think that Margulis and her son, Dorian Sagan, in 1997, and other places in both Margulis's and Lovelock's writing, you find the idea expressed in the box below. Life at the surface of the Earth seems to regulate itself in the face of external perturbation, and does so without regard for the individuals and species that compose it. In other words, the interests of the individual organisms and the individual species that collectively make up the biosphere are subsumed to the evolutionary interests of the biosphere as a whole. That's why Darwinists hated the notion of Gaia. This didn't make any sense to the way we thought about and still, by and large, think about the evolutionary process if we are legitimate mainstream Darwinists. So that's what I'm next going to talk about. Imagine some cycle like the nitrogen cycle. This would be one of the many homeostatic systems which Margulis and Lovelock would have said, and the quote on the lower right is from that paper I just showed you, an active adaptive control system able to maintain the Earth in homeostasis. So the nitrogen cycle would be a paradigm case of an active adaptive control system able to maintain the Earth in homeostasis. Because there is a cycle for nitrogen, everything doesn't pile up in some undecomposable or unmetabolizable or unassimilatable form of nitrogen, which would obviously be lethal to all life if that were to happen. So there is a cycle which recycles nitrogen. By calling this an active adaptive control system able to maintain the Earth in homeostasis, they're basically saying that the nitrogen cycle is a function for the biosphere as a whole. It's a function. It has the purpose of maintaining the biosphere. That was definitely the kind of teleological thinking that they engaged in. And to a Darwinian, that means that a function must be maintained by natural selection for global homeostasis. There must have been some selection at some level in order to create systems whose purpose was to maintain the homeostatic system, to maintain the system as suitable for life in the long run. That was the Gaia hypothesis. Darwinians found it incredible for a variety of reasons, but basically for this reason, as expressed in the box. For instance, for the nitrogen cycle, a complete nitrogen cycle is only a very long-term benefit to any of the microbial taxa involved in it. None of the taxa themselves even know that they're involved in the nitrogen cycle, nor do they care. So how could natural selection acting on individual taxa be said to favor the nitrogen cycle as a whole? It would favor the individual steps in the sense that organisms each derive some benefit from performing their part of the cycle, but they don't derive any benefit from the cycle as a whole, except the very long-term one, which was if there was no cycle, they eventually would die. But that's a very long-term eventuality, millions of years compared to the life cycle of organisms. So evolutionary entities are basically selfish. They cannot plan for the future. So evolution by natural selection, as Darwinians understood it, could not account for the Gaia hypothesis. I was one of the first actually to react against this, and I published a paper in a journal called Coevolution Quarterly. I had originally sent the paper to the New York Review of Books, but if you're not a famous biologist, you can't publish in the New York Review of Books. And Lynn Margulis, whom I said was my friend at the time, and who was also at that time quite willing to brook controversy or disagreement with her own ideas, helped me get this into something called the Coevolution Quarterly, which was the outgrowth of the Whole Earth Catalog, which ancient hippies will probably remember they like to look at. I certainly did. So what I said in my critique was that no serious student of evolution would suggest that natural selection could favor the development in one species of a behavior pattern which is beneficial to another, if this behavior were either detrimental to or of no selective value to the species itself. Secondly, that selective pressure against irresponsible behavior against cheaters will not be felt for thousands of millions of years, during which time irresponsible mutants or cheaters, which may well have a temporary selective advantage, would have replaced all responsible members of the species. The editor himself put in the comment, how does a species of one evolve, which was certainly part of the critique. And so in the end, I said that I didn't doubt that maybe it's certainly possible that some feedback loops of the kind that Lovelock claimed to exist do exist, but I doubted that, well, I very much denied that they could be caused by natural selection or that they could be anything but accidental. So that if Gaia was a real thing, it was not the product of natural selection as we currently could understand it, but just good luck. Other Darwinians equally objected. Maynard Smith called Gaia an evil religion. Stephen Jay Gould called it a metaphor, not a mechanism. Paul Ehrlich, radical and dangerous, and Robert May, an ecologist, called Lovelock a holy fool. Particular critique, the one referring to how does a species of one evolve, was elaborated by Richard Dawkins in his Extended Phenotype book in 1982. He said, the universe would have to be full of dead planets whose homeostatic regulation system has failed, with, dotted around, a handful of successful, well-regulated planets, of which the Earth is one. Even this improbable scenario is not sufficient to lead to the evolution of planetary adaptations of the kind Lovelock proposes. In addition, we would have to postulate some kind of reproduction whereby successful planets spawn copies of their life forms on new planets. And that's certainly one of the kind of criticisms one hears about the Gaia hypothesis, that there are multiple Gaia-like entities to be competing with each other in an evolutionary process. So what Dawkins is referring to and what I was objecting according to was our understanding of evolution by natural selection, or ENS, and Richard Lewontin in the 1970s and 80s promulgated a three-part understanding of what evolution by natural selection is, which I think most Darwinists would still buy into, which is that natural selection entails heritable variation and fitness. There have to be replicating entities which show heredity, which vary amongst themselves and which vary in such a way that their fitness is affected. In other words, their ability to make progeny is affected. So evolution by natural selection is basically identical to the differential reproduction of selected entities in populations because of their possession of heritable fitness conferring traits, which we would call adaptations. To be such an entity is to be what I call a unit of selection. By those criteria, Gaia is not a unit of selection. She's not a single entity, doesn't reproduce, not part of a population. In contrast, the organisms and species that make up Gaia do exhibit heritable variation and fitness and are selfish. Differential reproduction is what they're about, and that selfish evolutionary interests of the individual organisms and species that make up Gaia would defeat any possibility of it being a collective entity selected to be stable. That would have been our criticism in the 80s, and it still is nowadays the criticism of Darwinians about the Gaia hypothesis. Peter Godfrey Smith is a philosopher of biology, one of the sharpest ones that I think, and very strictly Darwinian in his orientation. And he recently reviewed Lovelock's most recent book in the London Times Literary Supplement, and he said of the Gaia hypothesis, the fact that the Earth is not like an organism, as the Gaia hypothesis would have it, the fact that the Earth is not like an organism doesn't make it impossible for some of those relationships, those homeostatic relationships, to be present. If they arise as fortuitous byproducts of the evolution of particular living things. In other words, the lower left, after each step although each step in the nitrogen cycle is beneficial to the effects of the perform it, that there is a cycle at all is a fortuitous byproduct of those selected things. Maybe it's one which our lives depend upon, but it isn't the result of natural selection for the completion of the cycle. Lovelock and his supporters understood the nature of the Darwinist critique, and elaborated some models which they hoped would explain how it is that Gaia could arise by natural selection. And these models, which get quite elaborate towards the end, but I will just show a simple one, are called daisy world models. So in a daisy world model, what the graph is meant to show is solar luminosity, the brightness of the sun, which has apparently been increasing throughout the history of the Earth. Dangerous for us in that case, at the beginning. So imagine that the sun was getting hotter and the planet was warming up. And imagine that the planet was covered with daisies, black daisies or possible white mutant daisies. And imagine that the black daisies absorb more light and heat themselves up and the planet up. So when the planet was too cold, there would be lots of black daisies and they would warm the planet up and warm themselves up at the same time. When the temperature got too high, then the black daisies would be selected against and mutant white daisies would be selected for, because the white daisies, at least compared to the black daisies, would cool themselves and the planet down. That would result in the stabilization of the planetary temperature, a homeostatic stabilization. If it got too cold, then the black daisies would come back, too warm, and then the white daisies would dominate. The trouble with this model, although it does indeed lead to a kind of a homeostatic regulation until the temperature gets too high, in which case all the daisies die, is that it's rigged. It assumes that black daisies absorb more light and heat themselves up and also the planet up, and that white daisies cool themselves down and also the planet down, although that is what we would assume about those colors of daisies. It isn't a necessary assumption, and one could imagine scenarios under which the black daisies might in fact heat the planet, or the white daisies might heat the planet even further for some other reason, and there's no guarantee, in other words, that there will be a negative feedback loop such as that built into that daisy world model. There can just as easily be positive feedback loops, which would ultimately drive the temperature even higher, even faster. So in order to get guaranteed homeostatic systems, you need something else. Tim Linton and Andrew Watson, who are Lovelock supporters, and geophysicists of some repute, and defenders of the Gaia hypothesis, recognize this fact. They would call what I was just talking about lucky Gaia. According to lucky Gaia, it is just good luck that the Earth happens to possess predominantly regulatory feedbacks or negative feedbacks. In contrast, probable Gaia postulates that there are some basic principles at work that lead one to expect regulatory feedbacks to predominate. One would expect, according to some other principle, not necessarily an evolutionary principle, that negative feedbacks would dominate. Whether that's so or not, that's an empirical question. In our view, the present debate about Gaia boils down to whether lucky Gaia or probable Gaia is closer to the truth. They think it probably is closer to the truth, but others do not. Toby Tyrrell, who's also a modeler, biogeochemical modeler, and also in the UK, recently wrote a very critical and thorough book on the Gaia hypothesis and concluded that it could be some sort of, it could be that some sort of emergent property that arises in some as yet unappreciated way out of the extraordinarily complex web of ecosystems and evolutionary interactions. That could be the source of a probable Gaia. It could be that negative feedbacks are dominated by that. But that said, it has not so far been possible to identify, even in outline, any plausible reason why such an emergent property would be likely to arise. There's no, in his view, principled other cause that would predict that negative feedback loops would dominate. And W.D. Hamilton, one of the fathers of modern evolutionary biology, very much of a Darwinian, in a personal letter to Jim Lovelock, which was quoted in Michael Roos's book on the Gaia hypothesis, said that even if Gaia were probable, if there is not some entity in which natural selection can act to promote global homeostasis, she would fall outside the purview of Darwinism. Those are my remarks. And that's what I'm trying to say here, is that even if there were some accidental or non-evolutionary reason, non-Darwinian reason why negative feedback systems would be expected to dominate, we would we cannot really speak about Gaia as being an adaptive system with homeostatic mechanisms that are the product of natural selection if there's no entity in which natural selection can act. So Hamilton said in that letter, you are right in saying you have natural selection in your model. I live in Nova Scotia, so you're right in saying you have natural selection in your model, but it is of a very simplistic type so far, and to my mind is very far from showing how natural selection promotes planetary stability. So how are we going to deal with that? How can we reformulate Gaia in such a way that we can start to think about natural selection operating on a global entity of some sort? That's what the rest of this talk is about. And it's based on, I use a slogan which I call "It's the song, not the singer," to explain this hypothesis. This derives from, there was a Rolling Stones song a while back with a song in it called "It's the Singer, Not the Song," and there was also a movie with that title, which is where I derived my title from. So now I'm going to go through that notion, the song, not the singer, is rationale for a new theory. So imagine we have A, B, C, and D, or something like chemical intermediates in the nitrogen cycle. They're chemical compounds, metabolites, or they might be stages in some developmental process. The arrows are the various taxa guilds whose enzymes catalyze the cycle steps. So if that's a nitrogen cycle, then those arrows correspond to nitrifying bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, decomposers, organisms that make proteins, organisms that degrade them, whatever that's part of the nitrogen cycle. And in almost all cases, well, I think in all cases, each of those steps is catalyzed by a great variety of organisms, not necessarily phylogenetically related to each other, so we can call those guilds. They have ecological shared functions, even if they're not taxonomically related. So what I claim is that we should abandon any attempt to see these taxa or their constituent organisms as forming some sort of collective merged material unit of selection. That's the problem with the Gaia hypothesis and with other collective hypotheses about supraorganismal entities, is that they're still based on some kind of collective, multiple species, multiple cells, multiple physical entities, multiple organisms collectively operating. And that's what I'm saying isn't going to work. We should abandon any attempt to do that. And the reason we should do that is because Darwinists object to such attempts for several good reasons related to the improbability of broad interspecies altruism arising or being maintained by natural selection. So instead, we should look at the cycle itself as the real, though less material unit of selection. You there, Eric? Am I being audible enough? Not talking too fast?
No, we can hear you perfectly. Yeah, I mean, I think we're just all absorbing.
I'm not mumbling, am I? I tend to mumble.
Not.
Okay.
Yeah, and you would have heard me laugh about Nova Scotia, but
okay. I'm sorry. Every time I see NS, I think Nova Scotia, obviously. Okay, I will keep going then. So here's the theory. There's 8 steps towards the acceptance of this theory. To make it easier for you, I've broken it down into 3 parts. There's an observation, there's a model, and there's implications for evolutionary theory in the larger sense. So the observation is that microbial taxa servicing biogeochemical cycles, and I'm just going to be talking about biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle, but in principle, I think this works for instance, the interactions between microbes in a biofilm, or the interactions between microbes and their hosts in what are now called holobionts. But the microbial taxa servicing biogeochemical cycles are often not the same, but the cycles themselves are more stable. Metaphorically, it's the song, not the singer, that matters. That's why I use that metaphor. And there are many papers that indicate this kind of conclusion. The one that drew my attention recently was by some people at UBC. What they did was they classified, on the basis of their genome sequences, more than 30,000 marine microorganisms into metabolic functional groups: nitrogen fixers, anaerobes, aerobes, photosynthesizers, whatever. And they found that environmental conditions strongly influence the distribution of the functional groups in marine microbial communities by shaping metabolic niches. In other words, they could characterize the ecological character of a particular site by the composition of the functional assignments that they made on the basis of the genes in those genomes, but only weakly influence taxonomic composition within individual functional groups. Maybe that isn't expressed very clearly. What I mean is that if you look at the kind of metabolism going on at a particular site, sites that might be similar and expected to have particular kinds of metabolism, and you look at the functional genes, the metagenome based on protein coding genes, you will find that indeed comparable functions are going on at those sites. If you ask what taxa are present there, based on looking at their 16S ribosomal RNAs or some other phylogenetic marker, you'll find that that's more variable. So it's the song, not the singers. This is also a very common observation from microbiomic studies, probably much more common now in microbiomic work. So as I think we must all be aware, there's a huge amount of human poop being sequenced now, looking for the gene content and also for the taxonomic distribution of organisms, usually based on 16S ribosomal RNA sequences. And often those data are presented in a format like in the upper left-hand corner there, where the left-hand panels indicate the taxa that are present by their bacterial phylum, and you can see that that's very variable. The colors, they're arranged, but each of the bars, the vertical bars, corresponds to one of 142 different individual poops from humans. You can see that there's quite a lot of variability in the taxonomy at those samples, and the songs, or in other words, the metabolic functions that are being performed on the basis of cog assignments of those functional genes, are much more constant. So again, it's the song, not the singer, that seems to be conserved between comparable sites. So those are the observations. The model is that, I'll just read this, such cycles, biogeochemical cycles, which I'm also referring to as analogizing the songs, are reconstructed each time a community of organisms whose individual species can carry out their steps. Singers who know their individual parts is recruited from the environment. And the existence of a cycle stimulates the evolution of guilds of organisms benefiting from performing its steps. Because of lateral gene transfer, guilds can be taxonomically diverse. So that's explained more carefully here. Imagine, for instance, that we have something that's accumulating A. The accumulation of metabolite A provides a niche for organisms that can make a living converting it to B to evolve and diversify. This happens many times in lateral gene transfer, which is a very useful adjunct to the diversification of organisms of a guild. A bunch of organisms taxonomically unrelated but capable of the same function spreads those relevant genes even further. So a diverse guild is created. So because there's a song, there are singers. Imagine that the nitrogen cycle already exists, then organisms which can carry out its steps will be encouraged to evolve because there is money to be made, energy to be gained from performing those steps. And a great variety of organisms have been selected in order to do that. Because there's a song, there are singers. Similarly for the other steps in the cycle. The guilds perpetuate the cycle. These organisms perpetuate the cycle. Indeed, even if it's disrupted, they will reconstruct it. If you can imagine that the nitrogen cycle would be for some reason interrupted tomorrow, it would start again right away because the organisms that carry out its steps know how to do the steps. And even though they don't know what collectively they are doing, each of them will perform its role. So because there are singers, there's a song. And as the singers become more numerous and proficient, which they will do because of evolution by natural selection, the song becomes more persistent. It evolves by natural selection. So that's the evolutionary entity that I'm trying to introduce and recognize, which is the song itself becomes a unit of selection. It's something which can improve by natural selection. It's something that persists. So this is just a sort of an aside to show how lateral gene transfer can spread metabolic activities, which are what characterize particular ecological sites between taxa, which are otherwise quite unrelated to each other. So the diversity of guilds is quite enormous, and that, again, is the major finding on which this hypothesis was first based. So what are the implications for the theory? So the theory, again, is that what we should be looking at as a unit of selection is not a collection of organisms or even the collection of species which collectively benefit from it, but in fact the cycle which they collectively perform itself is the unit of selection. So the implications for theory are a couple. 5, no individual reconstruction of a cycle or the singing of a song is the parent of any subsequent reconstruction, since each involves de novo assembly by recruitment from the community. My song and singer analogy works very well here. My wife participates in the singing of Handel's Messiah every Christmas time here in Halifax, and The Messiah is sung every Christmas time here in Halifax, but it isn't always the same people that sing the song. And so you cannot say that the singing of the song in 2014 is the ancestor of the singing of the song in 2015. It might as well be the answer to the singing of the song in Cincinnati or Toronto if you're going to try to identify ancestors. So any system, any song that perpetuates itself by recruiting singers de novo each time is not, there's not a parent-offspring relationship between the singings of the song. Nor is there a parent-offspring relationship between the song and the singers themselves. The song is an abstract idea, and the singers are people with voices. It's a category error to assume that there's a song-singer parent-offspring relationship. So there's not the kind of parent-offspring relationship which is enshrined in evolution by natural selection, which involves replication of entities that can be tracked down to a parent-offspring relationship. So without parent-offspring lineages, natural selection entails differential persistence, propensity to be reconstructed, not differential reproduction. So that's the different part about biogeochemical cycles or other interaction patterns as units of selection. They are selected for differential persistence, a propensity to be reconstructed, not for differential reproduction, because they don't actually reproduce. They are simply reconstructed. So that's illustrated here. They persist through reconstruction, recurrence, or recruitment. I summarize this by saying they reproduce, but they don't reproduce, if that makes sense. They're produced again and again and again, but they don't actually reproduce as physical entities in the way that organisms or even species arguably do. Species are considered to speciate as a physical process. This is not a physical process, or it's a recruitment process. It's not. Okay, that's probably clear. So the fitness of any cycle is just its propensity to be reconstructed at future times. Some cycles are more easily reconstructed than others, or more broadly reconstructed, and those cycles are fitter than other cycles, which are less frequently reconstructed. So one expects to find persistent cycles that have certain properties. So here we imagine that different cycles will have different propensities to persist, and these are subject to improvement. They're improved by the evolutionary activities of the performers of the cycles, as, let's say, going back to nitrogen fixation, their selection on organisms to perform their steps of the nitrogen fixation cycle ever more efficiently because they make more money from doing that. That in itself makes the cycle more efficient, but the organisms are not selected for the purpose of making the cycle more efficient. It becomes more efficient, and cycles that are more efficient or more economical or can encourage more taxa to recruit more taxa to perform their steps will persist for longer. So they're subject to improvement, and such cycles are, I would say, units of selection. So the propensity of a biogeochemical cycle to persist, or the singability of the song, in turn depends on the ease of establishing large diverse guilds, immunity to rogue reactions, prevalence and stability of conditions of recruitment, and compatibility with other cycles. This propensity can and will increase incrementally thanks to the selfish evolution of the singers. So this is a diagram from a paper by Paul Falkowski's group, just reminding us that biogeochemical cycles are not isolated things. They are all connected to each other because the organisms which perform some of the steps of some of the cycles also perform some of the steps of some of the other cycles. So there's an interconnectedness of biogeochemical cycles when it's, in effect, makes the whole thing one big metacycle. So what I've done, however, is I've made it necessary to reformulate evolution by natural selection. So the first thing I've done is I propose that Lewontin's formula for evolution by natural selection needs to be modified with the insertion of or persistence after reproduction, and evolution by natural selection equals differential reproduction or persistence of selected entities and populations because of their possession of whatever. This is not a totally new thing for me to be saying. There are several other people who argue for persistence as being one of the possible outcomes of natural selection. Frederick Bouchard, a philosopher at the University of Montreal, has been one of the principal proponents of these, and people should look at his papers. He's been writing about this for longer than I have, arguing in more general sense that evolution by natural selection also affects persistence. He usually talks about things like clonal organisms, like the giant aspen grove in Utah, which consists of one single organism, thousands of years old, and many, many individual trees, but it's actually one clone. And it's gotten better at surviving because of the evolutionary activities of the trees that are parts of its clone, but it is nevertheless a single organism. So it's evolved to be persistent, evolved to be more. There's not more of them, there's only the one. So to get there from where we are in terms of Lewontin's three-part formula for heritable variation in fitness, we have to perform this intellectual maneuver that's illustrated here. I'll just read this. Evolution by natural selection is the greater relative representation at some time Tn later than T0 of certain types of entities by virtue of those types' possession of certain traits, these traits for that reason being adaptations and those entities being selected, just sort of definitional. 2, greater relative representation at time Tn than time T0 can be affected by either an increase in the numerator or a decrease in the denominator of the ratio selected entities over total entities. 3, reproductive selection, which is what we normally talk about, generally is taken to result from an increase in the numerator with the denominator held constant. That's what we usually understand as evolution by natural selection. Persistent selection, however, can be achieved through the denominator decrease alone. So in effect, that's what's happening in clonal evolution. And that's what's happening in persistence evolution, I would argue. You start out with many cycles, you wind up with fewer cycles. In the reconciliation proposed here, both types of selection require only some causal relationship, loosely defined and not necessarily resulting in parent-offspring lineages between entities at Tn and T0. So that gets me, I think, to evolution of something like the nitrogen cycle. We can look at the cycle itself as the unit of selection. It has a mechanism not of reproducing, but a mechanism of being reproduced by the tax that it encourages the evolution of. So there's a kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing going on here. The cycle exists, it encourages organisms to perform its steps. Because the organisms perform its steps are performed. The cycle persists because of the organisms it encourages to evolve. Those organisms themselves will evolve towards greater efficiency, making the cycle therefore more efficient, more persistent. So the truly persistent cycles on this planet, like the nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, those things have been through a lot of evolution and are stabilized by that process. That gets me to cycles. Perhaps I can connect the cycles, but it still doesn't seem to get me all the way to Gaia, so now I have to take those final steps. Because I modified Lewontin's formula first by saying that we could have differential reproduction or differential persistence of the selected entities. But I still left the in populations part, so we're back to the question of where's the population? Where are the rest of the Gaias? So again, Richard Dawkins said the universe would have to be full of dead planets whose homeostatic regulation systems have failed, with dotted around a handful of successful, well-regulated planets, planets of which the Earth is one, and thought that was a ridiculous idea, reductio ad absurdum, as philosophers would say. But I would say, sure, why not? Why is that not possible? And recently, just last year, Chopra and Lineweaver published a paper claiming that. So it's an interesting paper. What they suppose is that the reason that we have not yet been invaded and taken over by space aliens, and the reason we haven't actually discovered viable advanced civilizations on other planets with our telescopes, is not because life is very hard to evolve. And you could argue that life seems not to be very hard to evolve. I mean, it seems to have evolved here on this Earth in a few hundred millions of years, if the fossil record is at all right. So it doesn't seem like it's that difficult to get life going. What Chopra and Lineweaver says is it's difficult to keep it going. It poisons itself with oxygen, or it doesn't evolve something like Daisy World to maintain the temperature of the planet as suns warm up or change temperature adequately, and ultimately life kills itself off or dies off. It doesn't protect itself well enough. Only in some places has global homeostatic systems of the Gaian sort evolved and allowed for the evolution of a biosphere with intelligent beings on it capable of engaging in such speculation. So that's a form of natural selection, and it's a form of a population. It's just that we can't see the other entities. I published a paper somewhat similar to that, perhaps my most widely uncited paper, which was in 2014 in Biology and Philosophy, where I made a similar argument, pointing out that if there is some way for a persistence-enhancing mutation to be a global mutation, then the mere fact that it allows more time for more mutations to evolve would imply that if there is such a thing as persistence-enhancing mutations, if you look at more and more persistent biospheres, you will find more and more of those mutations. Kind of a tautological point, but an important one, I think. And anyway, I don't have to go there, because I think most people, including most of your audience, probably believe something like this. They probably believe that, and I believe that all current life that we know about evolved from what we call the last universal common ancestor by definition, but we imagine that the last universal common ancestor was perhaps a species, perhaps a single cell, maybe even a population, but it certainly had certain common properties. For instance, the universal genetic code, which all extant organisms basically share, would have been one of the properties of that early ancestor, which was part itself of a kind of a biosphere. But I don't think, if we think about it, we would imagine that that organism was alone on the planet. There would have been other living systems, cell-like entities with their own alternate genetic codes, their own ways of doing biochemistry, some of which would be the same, some of which would be different, which have since gone extinct. The notion that there's a shadow biosphere, which is motivating much search for bizarre 16S RNA sequences or other bizarre metabolisms out there by metagenomic methods, is a claim that there might indeed be shadow life out there which is not descended from Luca, but which is descended from some ancestor of Luca. So basically, I think that our current understanding of evolution would imply that there were other biospheres which have other global communities of organisms which have since gone extinct. Some of the things that have made Gaia particularly successful, you might say, would be the universal genetic code, which, however you look at it, does seem to be somewhat optimized to avoid deleterious non-synonymous mutations occurring. It is clearly optimized by lateral gene transfer. Lateral gene transfer does serve the global function of maintaining genes which otherwise might be lost to the system. So there are many things about the current life on this planet which you might say are optimized for evolvability. There's an evolvability component to many of our cellular systems, which makes sense if we see those as Gaian adaptations, which were not possessed by these other imaginary, but nevertheless almost certainly one-time existing other biospheres. So what I'm trying to say by this is that we don't have to go to other planets to imagine that there were competitors, that there was a population of Gaian-like entities. So that's pretty much the talk. I want to thank the philosophers that have been engaged with me on this effort, because it's really a philosophical effort. Maureen O'Malley, who was a postdoc with me many years back and has recently wrote a book called Philosophy of Microbiology, which I recommend you all read. Tyler Brunette, who's a student, soon to go off to the UK. Austin Booth and Carlos Mariscal, who are my postdocs, both with PhDs in philosophy, who are my postdocs last year, and Drew Aikpin, who is my postdoc this year. Together we form what I'm calling facetiously the Dalhousie Group in High Throughput Metaphysics and Translational Philosophy. And I've also referenced one of the papers by Fred Bouchard down below because I think it's really quite relevant to the kind of argument that I'm putting forth today. And Litesh Manel and Gordon Hewitt were philosophy professors here at Dalhousie who've been influential for me. So I'm going to summarize the whole talk in this lengthy screed here, which I just will read, but I think it does summarize everything I said. One might want to describe homeostatic properties or activities of higher level entities, such as holobionts, ecosystems, or Gaia, as adaptations or functions for those higher level entities. If so, he or she must argue for more than the selection of those properties activities as mere consequences of lower level selection on their components, organisms or species. Such fortuitous byproducts, even if a predictable result of coevolution, are not enough. The higher level entities must themselves be units of selection, and homeostasis must be selected for at that higher level. 2, higher level entities that are recurrently assembled de novo from lower level physical entities cannot be units of selection, although these latter may have co-evolved with fortuitous benefit to the higher level entity. But the collective homeostatic properties or activities of higher level entities might themselves be reified as an immaterial unit of selection. So that's the whole point that I'm trying to draw here, is that if we look at the cycles themselves as songs rather than the singers as what selection addresses, then we can actually speak of global adaptations, global homeostatic mechanisms in the way that Lovelock initially wanted to do. So collective homeostatic properties, activities of higher level entities might themselves be reified as an immaterial unit of selection, material units of selection, insofar as their existence generates lower level entities that implement them, as in the song generating the singers. Because such units of selection are reproduced rather than reproduced, selection addresses their persistence, at least primarily. Persistent selection requires modification of the Lewontian paradigm for evolution by natural selection. And all I'm really saying, and this is what I think maybe makes me a philosopher, is that I'm not saying that this is true. I'm simply saying that if you want to talk about global homeostatic functions or Gaian adaptations, this is the way you have to do it. This is the formal structure in which it's possible to be a Darwinist and at the same time believe in the possibility of Gaia. So that's the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was really fascinating and yeah, definitely thought-provoking. So I want to remind people that you can ask questions through tweeting Phyloseminar or through IRC as described on the Phyloseminar rules. If you wouldn't mind going back to that, or yeah, that's yeah.
Well, I can do that. Yep.
No, it's fine. This is fine. I mean, so I guess one thing that I wonder is this, like, would the Gaia theorists consider what you're talking about with these geochemical cycles? Would they consider this to be Gaia theory as well?
Well, I'm just trying them out on this. I mean, this is a new idea, right? I mean, this paper just appeared tomorrow. So I've got the slide back up, or I think I've got the slides back up, yes.
Yeah, I meant, like I was enjoying reading the overview recaps.
Oh, okay, well, I can get that back.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're responding to this. I mean, I think that they haven't come up with this themselves, as far as I can tell. I think they're still trying to model Gaian adaptations as the collective response, the collective product of the actual organisms functioning in some kind of coevolutionary sense, which is what I'm arguing won't do it. So I did send my paper to Tim Linton, who is a very smart man, I think, and not an evolutionary biologist. He's more of a biogeochemical modeler type person than a modeler. And I think he liked it. I think they're thinking about it. The first representation of this idea was actually not about Gaia. We published a paper in Biology and Philosophy just a couple months ago about holobionts, because that's an area in which similar thinking has been involved. People have been claiming that we and our microbiome are together one evolutionary unit. You've probably heard that. And that, to my mind, makes no sense if, in fact, we don't inherit our microbiomes directly from our parents. If the symbionts or the microbes in a parent macrobe are also the parents of the symbionts or the microbes in the child macrobe, if there's vertical inheritance of both partners, then that can be a unit of selection, a true holobiont. But in many of the things that people are calling holobionts, that's not the case. The child recruits new bacteria from the environment, and even we recruit new bacteria. I mean, we don't have the same bacteria that we were born with. We have different bacteria. So even if we are functioning in a sort of an organismal sense, we are not a unit of selection. And so it was, in thinking about that, my postdoc and I, Austin Booth and I, realized, well, gosh, maybe if we thought instead about the combined metabolism that we and our microbiome have, because supposedly it does help us digest our food and provides vitamins and develop our immune system, the whole collection of collective activities that we share with our microbiota, if that itself were the unit of selection, which encourages the evolution of both microbes and humans, which will carry out its steps, then we actually do have something that is a unit of selection, but it's not a material thing, it's a process. So that's where that kind of thinking first came from. But it seems to me it extrapolates quite readily to biogeochemical cycles or almost any other interaction.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be interesting to, I mean, I was just trying to think about what are ways in which this could be in some sense tested, or, I mean, maybe I'm bringing too much of a like reductionist.
Well, that is the question that I've been asked a few times that I've talked about this in public, and I haven't got a terribly good, I have two answers to that. One is the so what answer. I mean, I think that this is a theory of the same form as the theory of evolution by natural selection as we understand Darwin articulated it, which is really just if you have replicating entities which have heredity and which differ in their ability to replicate, then whatever those traits are that make them better replicators will become more common in the population, right? I mean, that's got to be true. That's a logical principle. It doesn't matter whether there's no cases of that in the world. It's still true. It's like 2 + 2 = 4. It's a logical, well, maybe not like that, but it's a logical, it follows automatically from the premises. It doesn't require any experimental proof. So what Darwin did was two things. He uncovered that principle, which was sort of lingering in the background of Western philosophy for a long time, because he pointed out how operating through reiterated cycles, you could get actually exquisite adaptations out of it. He discovered that, he rearticulated that principle, and then he also claimed that it was explanatory for a large number of adaptations in the real world. So I'm just articulating a principle at the moment. I'm not claiming that it's responsible for a lot. I'm just showing you how it is a principle comparable to evolution by natural selection as it affects entities, as it's also something that affects processes. So in a sense, I'm not saying anything different than people who are talking about cultural evolution would say. I mean, this is very much like meme evolution, right? I mean, it's a meme is an immaterial phase, the songs and not the singers. I mean, meme evolution is about songs and singers. So I'm simply trying to bring that down to the physical level.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's true or not, my second kind of answer to that question is, well, imagine you set up a bunch of reaction vessels, culture vessels, sealed with microbes from the environment, or else select collection of different species that you put in there with a certain limited amount of nutrients, and you never gave them any more nutrients, they would eventually die. But some of them might learn how to recycle those nutrients amongst themselves, and then they wouldn't die nearly so quickly. So if you came back, you would discover that those vessels, which still had life going on in them, were ones in which the microbes had actually learned how to recycle, evolved in order to recycle the metabolite, the compounds that you gave them. And I would say that proves my hypothesis. Somebody would say, oh, no, it doesn't. They're just what you'd expect. But so I don't, I'm not quite sure what would constitute proof. To my mind, that would constitute a form of proof, although I expected it would work some of the time too.
Yeah. And you raised sort of an interesting point there, which is there's interaction between the level of selection, right? I mean, you are introducing this notion of selection on the cycle itself, which makes sense because that's sort of the new thing. But I mean, there's going to be, the selective forces on the cycles are going to imply natural selective forces on the organisms composing the cycles. And that's a rich direction to explore.
No, that's quite true. I mean, there's a well-developed body of evolutionary theory called multi-level selection theory, which you're probably familiar with, which, selection operates on our cells, but also on our multicellular selves, and those are in opposition to each other. I mean, selection operating our cells produces cancer, for instance, so that's not a good thing. And many people believe that selection operates at the level of species too, favoring species which speciate more frequently or go extinct less frequently. And so the general argument for why there's sexual reproduction is because it prolongs the life of species or helps them speciate more frequently. And so that downwardly causes the fact that we are sexual organisms. It's because of the benefit to species that species are sexual. So this is very much like a multi-level selection argument, except that I think that other multi-level selection arguments go from genes to genomes to cells to organisms to species, and cycles is not like the next organizational level higher because it's not a physical thing. So it's like a parallel rather than a superimposed higher level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it explicitly ignores the interrelation, like genetic interrelationship. I mean, whether multiple participants in a cycle are related or not has nothing to do with it. It's...
Right. No, and that was the stimulus to thinking about it in the first place. But yeah, no, it doesn't. So it really is. It's the processes. I mean, there's a philosopher named Jean Dupré in the UK who is arguing strongly for what he calls process ontology, claiming that, for instance, we as organisms are more like processes than we are like things. And in a sense, that's true. I mean, I'm made up of relatively few of the atoms that I was made up of when I was a child, and yet the process of being me has been perpetuated so that I still am the same person, as it were. There are philosophical aspects of that, but there are also just very physical aspects of that. So this is a form of what he calls process ontology, where I'm saying the process is actually a real thing and in some ways more important than the actual things that carry out the process.
Right. So, I mean, in the course, I mean, I guess that sort of leads naturally into asking about, like, I mean, you're thinking, a lot more abstractly about the items that are undergoing selection in Darwinism, and you mentioned aspen groves as another example of something that is sort of a different type of thing that's being under selection. I mean, are there other examples?
Well, I think there are many clonal organisms that, like the aspen grove, where there are a huge bunch of what are called ramets for plants or something. I mean, individual things that look like plants but are actually part of the same clone. And what Fred Bouchard has talked a lot about is how those things actually get more persistent with time, which they do. And the reason they get more persistent with time is that evolution operates on the individual ramets, the individual plant-like entities, and making them, in a sense, operating in the normal way that evolution by natural selection operates. But since the whole thing is one genetic entity, it's the effect on that on the whole thing is to make it more persistent. Makes sense or not? I know nothing about evolutionary models for human consciousness or mental activities, but some of them are evolutionary in this same sort of way, where there's not necessarily a competing population of things going on. So that it is possible to develop such models for persistence rather than differential reproduction as the goal of evolution.
Yeah. It seems like the evolutionary game theory people would have something to say about this.
They possibly do.
Say again?
They possibly do. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, often people will say, well, evolution is about survival and reproduction, right? They'll say that. But they really mean survival. The purpose of survival is to live long enough in order to reproduce. I mean, that's the way we normally think about it.
Yeah.
But in fact, the other way to think about it, the way that Fred Bouchard has often talked about it, is actually reproduction is another way to survive. So I have my first really pure philosophy paper in philosophy of science that came out also quite recently. I argue that clades are selected for persistence. So, I mean, we can talk about species being selected because they do reproduce and acts of speciation, but a clade consisting of the last common ancestral species and all its descendants, that can't reproduce, right? I mean, it makes more species, but then it just gets fatter. It doesn't reproduce. It just gets bigger.
Uh-huh.
So, but there are things that will make a clade persist for longer, and those are having more species, having species that are more geographically dispersed, or having species that are more ecologically variable from each other. Because in the case, in all those cases, some single event or some geographically localized event or some ecologically specific event isn't going to wipe them all out, right? But it isn't actually to the advantage of the individuals within those species, or even to the species themselves. If I'm a species, I don't care how many other species are in my clade. So those are clade level properties. How many species you have, how geographically dispersed they are, and how ecologically differentiated they are. Those are clade level properties. Clades which have those properties to a high degree are less likely to be wiped out as clades. Right. So in a sense, that is a form of persistent selection. Some clades, and that's what paleontologists do all the time, actually, is to look at the fossil record for what clades have lasted longer, what clades have gone extinct, that sort of thing. So in a sense, that's also persistent selection.
And there are indeed even mathematical models for the diversification of higher level clades and, you know, for their survival as well. So,
oh, for sure. That's quite presumably very modelable.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Doolittle, that has been really a pleasure to hear from you. And I think we're going to wrap up. Yeah, so the next one, we're going to be returning, we're going to be completely flip-flopping from philosophy to pretty technical mathematics. Maybe it's not so much of a flip-flop, but next session is going to be about phylogenetic invariance. So.
Okay, all right, bye.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yep.